Okay, so thank you. Today I've been asked to talk about the biostatistical design considerations for community engaged research, excuse me. And that's not going to work. Maybe that'll work. There we go. So the topic outline I want to go through is just kind of go over a couple of the traditional research design concepts that kind of hold true regardless of the type of study that you're doing. Then I'll get into some of the changes that are made to those designs to allow us to accommodate, larger community-based type research, and then get into some of the outcomes and the way we interpret them, or really more the way we define them rather than interpret them necessarily. So transition slide there, here we go. So first off with the definitions. So as a statistician, biostatistician, we're like wired initially to think of everything as experimental and observational units. In the real world, an experimental unit would be the same thing as something that somebody would say is like a study unit. In essence, it's the smallest unit where we're actually applying some condition that we're interested in learning about. So that's the smallest entity, whatever that entity happens to be. That could be an individual, it could be a collection of individuals. Then the observational unit is the smallest unit on which we can actually take a measurement. So if I'm thinking of, say like a classroom in a school and I'm trying to capture test scores, each individual student would have a test score, but we would actually take the measurement on the classroom, which would be an aggregate of all the test scores of all the students within the class. So at that point, the observational unit and the study unit are not the same thing. In traditional studies, most of the time we try to define our experimental unit or our study unit as the observational unit. So that's one change that we're going to see happens as we move forward. Then we talk about this idea of treatment or condition design. And that's really how are we organizing the conditions that we want to study? So how are we putting those together? And I'll talk about it, kind of what I call the Mark 1 Mod 0 ways of thinking of those. And then we have the experimental or study design itself, which is how are we actually organizing our experimental or our study units to receive these conditions and then determine how are we going to analyze those to determine has our condition caused an effect, or has it had an association anyway. So our overall goal with study design in general is we want a study design that actually follows through with our study intent. And along with that, we also want to be able to minimize our bias. And when we talk about minimizing bias, the design elements there, which I will talk about in a little bit, are trying to make sure that we're not putting any one group. So like if I'm thinking of any one group into one condition. So if I'm thinking of a clinical trial and say I'm looking at some sort of pain medication, well, if I put all the people that have a really high pain tolerance in one group that happens to have the most expensive drug, and I put everybody that has a quote unquote low pain tolerance in the really inexpensive drug, I'm going to artificially make it look like the expensive drug outperforms the less expensive drug. And that's not necessarily true. And that would be purely a bias in the way subjects were assigned their condition. And then the next thing we want out of our goals is to address, we want our design to actually address the appropriate questions about the treatments or the conditions that we have of interest. So are we actually going to be able to measure, once we get through all this, some sort of outcome that actually measures the effect of our treatment or our condition? So our study intent has to be directly aligned with our research question and the resulting hypothesis. And I don't want to get too far into defining study intent because those are all over the map. But what I do want to kind of bring up here is the idea of when we talk about a specific type of study, if I say I'm doing comparative effectiveness, that's typically implying I have some sort of two-sided hypothesis. I don't know which one's going to do better or worse than the other, but I want to allow either direction. So I'm going to do comparative effectiveness, and that's typically going to bring up a two-sided hypothesis. Then you'll hear people speak of superiority or inferiority studies. And basically what we're saying there is there's one side of we know, or we feel very strongly, we don't know, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing the study, but we feel very strongly that one of our conditions is going to outperform the other conditions. So we want to design our study to capture that. Then we also have other aspects where we're looking at non-inferiority. Let's take, for example, some sort of intervention at like a system level, and one is really expensive and manpower intensive, and the other one is less expensive because it's not as manpower intensive. And I want to look at non-inferiority, saying, well, as long as I can get within some window of each other, I'm going to call them equivalent. And if I can say they're equivalent, then I can obviously go with the one that has less time and money dedicated to it. The other types of study intents we have out there are quality improvement. You can have any type of hypothesis here, but technically they're not required so much, because you're not necessarily going after a concept of proving something, but you're trying to show that you're trying to better the process, if you will, in a quality improvement study. And then we have these other ideas of feasibility studies, which are really designed to determine, can I even implement what I want to do? Can I get this process to even work? Can I train a group to do what I need them to do in order to make this potentially successful, so we can study it further? So that's where feasibility would come in. And then the last one's going to be sustainability. And this one is longitudinal. And basically what we're trying to say here is, any gains that we make during like an active intervention period or something like that, or an active study period, can we maintain those once the study is quote unquote concluded? All right, so with regard to the treatment designs or the conditional designs, they can get much more complicated than this, but in general, what we're typically doing is looking at a specific set of either factors, whether they be categorical or, purely numerical on a more of a continuous scale. It doesn't really matter. But if I look at a single factor, this is something that has 2 or more levels. So in this example here, I'm just color coding, this, and I realize these colors are basically the same on the 2 ends. This is a really light yellow. This is a really light orange. But the different colors are supposed to represent the different factor levels here. So I basically have a single factor, but I have 4 different levels, whatever that happens to be. Then I have this concept of multi-factor with main effects. I'm doing this all in 2 dimensions because that's the easiest way to present it, but I can stack multi-factor. I can go, in this case, I have a 2 by 3 for a total of 6 combinations, or I could do a 3 by 3 by 3 and have a total of 27 combinations. I mean, I can make it as complicated as I want, but this is just for illustrative purposes. But when I talk about multi-factor with main effects, typically what we're saying here is we're not interested necessarily in how A and B necessarily work together, or we have some information that says whatever's happening in A doesn't affect B. So what we're really focusing in on are the marginal results of factor A without regard to the level of B. So that would be this kind of horrible gold color, the blue, and the gray. And then I have what is the effect, or the overall effect of the 2 levels of B, the red and the orange, without regard to level A, or to the levels of A. And then, I'm all over the place here. What happened? There we go. Then with regard to this one, when we talk about multi-factor with interactions, and again, this can get stacked up and be much more complicated than this. This is just an illustration. Again, we're sticking with the 2 by 3, but now we're interested in finding out, or we have information that says the way B affects our study unit may be different depending what level of A I'm actually operating at. So in this case, I'm actually interested in looking at the individual cell means, so the individual combinations of A level 1, B level 1, A level 1, B level, A level 2, B level 1, and A level 3, B level 1, and so forth. So those are the ideas of the treatment designs. And again, we could get more complicated and stack things up. And I'm not getting into the covariate and confounding piece yet. I'm going to get there. So once we have an idea of what we're going to do with our treatment design or the conditions that we're interested in, then we have to come up with a way of, well, how are we going to apply these to our subjects and how are we going to pull our measurements out? And here is where the idea of a study design comes in. And you typically sit down and the PI or whoever's kind of leading the research has an idea of what they can do. So some of the traditional designs are the completely randomized, where we're not taking into account anything. We literally just randomize conditions to our units, our study units or our experimental units, and then take our measurements. Then there's what's known as a blocked design. This is where we have some sort of structure around our experimental or study units that we want to account for. And we can do that in a couple of ways. We can do a clustered design, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, or I can do these clusters of like subjects in what's known as a design block. And as long as I replicate at least one replication of all the conditions within the block, and we can get more complicated than that, but I'm going to stick pretty simple here. If we can replicate an entire experiment or an entire study within a block, then all I have to do is I can carry the block as just as an effect, and basically maximize the variation between blocks and minimize the variation within blocks. And that allows me to absorb unexplained variance due to block without actually having to define what about the block is causing the variation. Then we have a pre-post design. This is where you take measurements at the beginning prior to intervention, and you take measurements after. This can be also referred to as a within subjects design, although I can do a between within design where I'm doing pre-post measurements on subjects as well as having subjects in different conditions and looking across at the post time point. Then we also have what's known as a repeated measures design, where every study unit is measured multiple times. Typically, if it's referred to as a repeated measures design, your time points are equally spaced, or at least definitively spaced, and everybody is measured within the window of the ideal spacing. Then we have the nested design, which is somewhat like clustering, where I've nested certain things. If you think about, this is going to be a simple example for like an agricultural study. If my outcome is, growth of, say, a tree or something like that, then I might be looking at the longest length of the leaf itself. So the longest measurement on a leaf. So if I'm looking at that, the leaf, the actual measurement unit, is nested within a limb, which is nested within a tree, which is nested within a plot of land. And I can keep looking back at all those, because I can't apply, say, fertilizer to the leaf itself, but I can apply it to the tree itself. So I might be using a plot of land as a block, say it's sandy soil, and I've got 3 different fertilizers, and I'm applying those to, say 9 trees. So 3 trees each get each level of the 3 different fertilizers, and I measure those leaves. So that's kind of the idea of nesting there. And then the last design I'm going to kind of talk about is the split or crossover design, or split and crossover design. So a split design is where I put one level, say factor A is on this larger unit, but then the larger unit can actually be broken up into smaller units, and I can apply factor B independently to the smaller units. So that would be a split design. In a crossover design, all subjects, all study level subjects get every level of the intervention or every level of the condition. It just depends on what order in which they get them or what sequence. So in those designs, we have some things we have to worry about, like the period effect, the sequence effect, washout periods, things like that. So if I'm going to try to minimize bias, there's a few things that I want to take into account. So from the design standpoint, there may be confounding variables. So oftentimes, one of the things we're asked to look at is, say, age or gender or education, or what other ones do we do often? disease stage, things like that, if I'm talking about human subjects specifically. Confounding, there's a lot of things that could be going on there. So obviously, if somebody is, say, first diagnosed with a cancer in stage 4, their prospect of outcome, of a good outcome, is a lot lower than somebody that was maybe diagnosed in stage 1. So that would be the example of a confounding type of situation. So we want to be able to look at that. Then we have randomization, the blocking, which I kind of talked about, and I'm going to get a little bit more into here. We have stratification and this idea of balance, and all of these can kind of work together to help us minimize balance in a study. So the confounding variables have a couple of different definitions, and it probably depends on your discipline as to which one you're most used to dealing with. So the definition 1 comes from Moses in 2009. So 2 variables are confounded if they appear in such a pattern that their separate effects cannot be distinguished. So when I was, brand new to statistics and everything, this is the way I was trained. This is the definition that I was given, is that I have 2 factors, and the way they actually were applied, I can't distinguish them entirely. I don't have enough information to truly separate what is the effect of A, what is the effect of B. The second definition is that the confounding variables are those that may compete with the exposure of interest in explaining the outcome of the study, which is the one that once I got working with the health field seems to be the more accepted definition of confounding. And basically what we're saying there is we have variables that are not only associated with the outcome, but they might be associated with something on the explanatory side of the model as well. So we have a little bit of a problem where we need to come up with a way to account for those. And then from the same article, Skelly was talking about people that ignore confounders, basically. And the warning here is that your confounders may mask an actual association. And in their particular experience, they found that more commonly what happens is that you'll demonstrate a false association because of the confounding when no real association exists. So it's just kind of a warning to say, confounding is something you really want to think about as you move through a design, and that's regardless of the type of study that you're doing, whether it's a traditional individual level model or you're doing a large scale, more at a systems level type of study. And then randomization, I think everybody's pretty familiar with this. My example is very benign here. So I've got 20 subjects, just 1 through 20, and I randomly assign them to conditions. So this is a completely simple random design, just shotgun them out there, so to speak. And 10 ended up in condition 1, 10 ended up in condition 2. And one of the things we may run into here is that just simple randomization may not be enough. So what we may have to do is bring into other plays some other things like blocking. So you'll hear people talk about block randomization, and they'll do it in blocks of 4 to 6. And typically what they're talking about there is, as I get my first 4 quote unquote volunteers, whether that be an entity like a clinic or a community-based organization, and I get 4 of those, then I'm going to randomize those 4 to 2 treatments. And then my next block is going to be 6. So I wait till I get 6 more CBOs brought into the study, and then I'm going to randomize those 6 to 2 treatments or something like that. And what that allows us to do is to manage the balance, to make sure we have basically equal numbers in each of the conditions, but it also allows us to prevent people from being able to anticipate what condition are they going to be assigned. And then blocking, I spoke about this a little bit before. So each of these white boxes is a block, a design block. And in this case, what I'm looking at is I have 6 entities within the block that are as like as possible for whatever reason. And I'm going to, I have 2 conditions. I have the gray condition and the red condition. I'm going to randomly assign the condition to these 6 entities within the block. And then I have B blocks total. So my block is typically just groupings of subjects that are alike. So an example of a group I've been speaking with over the last couple of weeks, they're looking at community-based organizations that provide support to domestic violence victims. And one of the things we could do with their study is look at the type of service each of these CBOs provides. So if I have a crisis shelter or versus a crisis hotline versus a support group versus just a shelter for people that need long-term a place to stay, those would all be concepts of a block. So say I have 4 or 5 entities that are offering crisis hotline type of services, those 5 to 6 would end up being a design block, and we would randomize our conditions within there to try to capture the effect of the different types of services that are available for victims of domestic violence without actually having to model a specific structure, if you will. Okay. And the other piece about a design block at its base level is supposed to have a minimum of 1 replicate of the base study within each block. You will hear people talk about incomplete block designs, which is another way we can get around this if we have more treatments than we have entities within a block, which we can handle. But as soon as you do that, you start introducing the artificial confounding, which is more the statistical, the way I was trained, which is I can't tease out the effect of A from B exactly. And then the last couple of things about minimizing bias are the stratification and balance. Stratification is often the natural grouping. The most obvious one I always use in my stats class is if I look at an undergraduate student population, I don't want to just randomly sample students because I might end up with all juniors or all, I guess, are we allowed to call them juniors or are they 3rd years now? Anyway, it's 3rd year undergrads or juniors, but I might end up with a complete imbalance and not a representation of the true student population. So what I would do in that case is I would come in and say, okay, I know my total student population is say 25,000 students. The largest class happens to be the freshmen. The next largest is the sophomores, and let's say the juniors and seniors are roughly the same size. I want to basically come in and I would stratify and sample out of those to get a representation. So that's from the sampling side. From a design side, or from an analysis side, I should say, I can handle some of the confounders if I have them, and I can do subgroup analyses on the stratification variable to say, okay, if I've done the overall model and I'm really worried about, let's say, gender, I can come in and stratify by gender, redo the analysis and find out, okay, for men and women, are we really still getting the same model, or is there something that I missed by lumping everybody together? And stratification is simple if I only have 1 or 2, maybe at the most 3 stratification variables. If I have more than that, I really need to handle it from a design analytical standpoint or an analysis standpoint, probably coming in and trying to determine weights and things like that to try to make my analysis as unbiased as possible. Typically, when I do studies, I end up working with sex or gender as one of the stratification variables. Oftentimes we'll look at age, education, race and ethnicity, and I've also been asked as far as insured/uninsured also pops up quite a bit. And I already talked about the analytical piece. And then the last idea is balance. And I put equal representation under each study condition in quotes, because a lot of times people are focused in on, I have to have 6 people in every single condition. That's not necessarily true, but what we don't want to have happen is when I go back and look at those multifactorial designs, say I've got a 3x3x3 where I have 27 little bins that I'm interested in and I've modeled an interaction. I don't want to have a group or one collection or one combination of all 3 factors where the factor levels have 0 observations. I want to have some representation everywhere that's a decent number to actually get a variance estimate so that I can actually feel confident in whatever mean or whatever my outcome happens to be, if that's the target, it's a mean, that I can actually give you a decent estimate. Because mathematically, a model will put an answer there. But if I have no observations to support it, it's literally a mathematical nicety that value is there. And we really would like to have some information there to be able to say, yes, this makes sense, or no, it doesn't. Okay, so now how do we take these ideas and make some accommodations for more of the community-based research? Because if you think about it, intervening at an individual level is awesome in a clinic where it's pretty easy to manage, and you've got, you know, dedicated, especially at an academic medical center, right? We've got research coordinators and all these people that can kind of take the reins and follow, okay, who was this person, what condition was this person randomized to, or if it's a drug study, you pass it off to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist is the only one that knows who gets placebo and who doesn't, that kind of stuff. So we can handle all that on a small scale. When we talk about we're trying to do something at the community level, and we're talking about intervening with a community-based organization or some entity that has a larger responsibility and most likely doesn't have a huge staff to support research as its end game, we have to come up with ways to manage this. And the easiest way to do that is to assign a single condition or a single treatment to a given CBO or entity. And that makes it where we're getting into where people talk about clustered designs. So in this case, what I'm basically trying to say in a very long-winded way is that the site itself is going to become the study or the experimental unit, and then the individuals within that unit, within that site, are going to become the units of observation. And our outcome now is some sort of aggregation of a measurement on the individuals making up the organization that we pull together and create one value for that location or site. Okay, so that leads me to the idea of sample size, and this is where the biggest issue, I guess I should take a minor step back here. So as far as the designs and as far as the study design itself, so whether it's pre-post, anything like that, I can apply any of those designs to this. Really, the only thing we're changing is the study unit. So we're clustering now into a larger entity. Where this has the biggest impact, where a lot of people run into problems, I guess, is that when we go into sample size, we have to come up with some justification of what effect are we looking for. Okay, well, once we have this effect, what is the variability I expect? So how much will this effect move if I were to replicate this study, you know, over and over again? How much will that value bounce around? Because every time I take one measurement, that's an N of 1. And then as I collect them and find and aggregate these together, it's a moving target left and right. And I'm waving my hands around. I assume you guys can't even see what I'm doing. Anyway, so what do we have to figure this out? So we need to know what hypothesis we're trying to test. So we need to know what is the study intent. We need to know what is the study design, so we know what is the analytical method that we're going to be using. Once I know the analytical method and the hypothesis, I can identify what is the type of effect size we're trying to calculate and trying to detect. And then I need to know what are the numbers in the groups or clusters in our case here, and what type of, or how many subjects or clients or whatever we want to call them, or observational units, are available at each cluster level. And the idea here is we're going to be balancing this idea of a type 1 error versus a type 2 error to try to come up with a true number of people or true number of entities that we're going to need, or a true number of clusters that we're going to need. And if you're unfamiliar with the statistics terms, we typically try to explain it with the jury system, right? So if I look at a trial, there are 4 possible outcomes. The person could be found guilty by the jury and actually be guilty, and that would be a correct answer. But our null hypothesis in a jury trial is that everybody is innocent. So that's the null. The alternative is guilty. So in this case, if they return a guilty verdict and the person is actually guilty, we're happy because it was correct. If I have a guilty verdict and the person was actually innocent, that's a type 1 error, and we don't want to make that mistake often. We want to try to avoid that error at all costs. So we try to make that as small a value as possible. Then we also have a not guilty verdict and the person being innocent, and then we would be correct. And that's, you know, again, we're happy in these two off diagonal situations. And then we have a not guilty verdict, and we call that a type 2 error. And here I'm willing to allow this error to be greater than a type 1 error, because if you think about it, it's potentially less of a worry, or it's the least of the two errors that you can make compared to putting somebody that's innocent in jail. So that's the idea here. So when we come down and apply that to a statistics hypothesis, we have the same thing. Our null can be true, and we can fail to reject, and we're correct, and we're happy, right? We're not going to know that, but we can fail to reject, and if it really is true that there is no difference or whatever we're trying to get at, that would be a good thing. What we want to try to minimize is rejecting when the null really isn't true. And that's what the type 1 error rate is. It's known as a false positive. And we'll call that alpha. When we talk about power, power is the ability to actually reject a null hypothesis and be correct, that there really is a difference. So that's what we're shooting for here. And typically that value we set at a minimum of 80%. And that leaves us with a type 2 error rate of 20%. So our type 1 error rate's usually around 5%, and our type 2 error rate's usually held around 20%. And the type 2 error rate's also known as a false negative. So we want to try to balance these two concepts. So if I have the effect to be measured, and often this comes from literature review or personal experience or preliminary studies or focus groups where you get subject matter experts together and they kind of talk about what they have seen or what they feel they have seen, and they kind of put everything together. And then we have to have some sort of capture of the uncertainty of the measurement itself. And then we also need to define the allowable type 1 error rate. And again, typically the default is 5%. So then the question becomes, what sample size do I have to have in order to achieve that 80% power under the conditions in the first line there? And again, our whole goal is to reject the null 80% of the time when the null is actually wrong. So that's the end goal. So when we get into a clustered trial, our sample size analysis is less straightforward than a traditional study, because now we have to account for clustering. Not only are we balancing our type 1, type 2 error and looking at what kind of difference do we expect to see, what are the possible values of the variance, or how imprecise can our measure possibly be. So we have to balance all those things together. Now we have to add in this idea of balancing how many true cluster or experimental units or study units do I have? So how many units do I have where I can actually apply a condition independently versus the number of observational units versus the number of clients, subjects, people, whatever, that are housed within each one of these experimental units. So what this brings in is an additional burden on the researcher, and the researcher really needs to reach out to the organizations they're going to be working with, because the organization themselves are going to know more about what we need than the individual researcher will. So here what we have are things like seasonal effects or just time effects in general. So it may not be seasonal, it may be, well, I guess it would be seasonal, but not the 4 seasons. So if you think as a police officer, right, if I was on the street on a Nebraska football game day, during the game, I rarely, if ever, got called. I mean, it was very, very, I hate to say it, but it was very boring, right? So nothing much was going on. And if we won, all the shifts after that, for probably about the next 16 hours, would have a very quiet day. On days where Nebraska was doing poorly at halftime, calls would start to tick up. And then if they got beat or blown out, calls really ticked up, which is very, I guess, indicative that Nebraska is, or at least Omaha, is a very football-oriented state or city. But anyway, that's kind of what I mean about time effects. So there may be something in there. It may not be seasonal, but there may be some sort of time effect that something's going on that we need to understand to help us determine what sample sizes are available at any given moment. Then the next thing we need to look at are cluster type effects. And again, this is going to come back to the concept of when I talked about the CBOs and for the domestic violence victims. And we have some that are like crisis hotlines, some are crisis care, some are shelter services, et cetera, support group services, that kind of thing. So we need to understand what is the function of the cluster in and of itself. And then the other thing we have is local issues. So if we're doing something where we're doing things across, the entire state of Nebraska, the cluster, an Omaha-based cluster or a Lincoln-based cluster may have completely different experiences than a cluster, say, in Ainsworth, or a cluster that would be found out in Scottsbluff or something like that. So we need to also understand some local issues. So there's a lot of things that kind of come into this to give us a decent shot at doing the power analysis. So the biggest issue here is that power cannot be increased by increasing the number of observational units alone. Again, in a traditional study, people will just say, well, collect more patients, right? Or collect more subjects. That's great because the subject, the observational unit and the study unit are the same thing. In this case, they are not. So at some point, you are going to have to increase the number of clusters. So I'm going to give you a quick example. In this case, we have a dichotomous outcome. So it's basically, call it yes, no. We have 9 clusters available. So the desired design is going to utilize 9 clusters. Each cluster has between 320 to 360 subjects or observational units. So we have, a little under 400 that we can actually take measurements on. But the effect size to be detected is moderately large. It's 0.72. So if you're familiar with Cohen, 0.2 is small, 0.5 is moderate, and 0.8 is large. So I'm calling this one 0.72 moderately large. So if I do this as a clustered design, as delineated here on the left, and I shoot for a desired minimum power of 0.8, you can see in this black curve, which is the effect size of 0.72, by the time I get to 1,500 observational units per cluster, I have flatlined. I am at 36% power, and I will never go up. I can throw in 100,000 people in every one of these clusters, and the power will never increase. So then I went back and said, well, what if our, for lack of a better term, our standard deviation, our error, is overestimated by a factor of 2. So I'm going to double my effect size. It still takes 1,800 people per cluster to reach 80% power, and that's doubling the effect size. And this is a very large effect size. So something's got to give. So one of the options we can do, and I've recommended this a number of times, we've utilized it a couple of times, and a lot of times they go out and try to find more clusters. But what I've done here is I've taken the original cluster, so the original 9 entities that were going to be our experimental units, and I break them into design blocks. And then I'm calling it practitioner. Let's say we have 4 practitioners on average at each cluster, at each level, or each original entity. And I'm going to use those practitioners within the block. Now I'm going to cluster on practitioners. So all the clients or subjects or patients that go to that practitioner will get the same treatment or condition assigned to them, but I will randomize the conditions to practitioner within my design block. So now I end up with an average of 4 clusters per block. And that's going to lead me down to an average of 80 to 90 subjects per cluster. Well, when I do that, that gives me 36 total clusters now. And it takes 84 subjects per cluster on average to achieve 80% power to detect the effect size that I want. And what I've done here is I start off with the original design, and then I keep adding in 3 clusters at a time as I'm moving up these lines. And you can see I never I mean, I get to 12, 15, 18 clusters. So I haven't quite gotten to 36 yet, and I still haven't gotten there. It takes me to 36 to get the number of subjects that I can actually support. Because if I take 4 times 80 or 4 times 90, that gives me 320 to 360. So I can support that because that's how many subjects my blocks now tend to see, because that was the original design. By using this practitioner or subclustering, if you will, and making things into a design block, I can recover the power that I need, albeit at a cost, because now logistically and managerially, it's going to be more difficult to implement this study than it would have been to just assign one condition to the overall cluster. So there is a cost at some point as well, but we can at least get at our original effect size and intent by doing something like this. Okay, and just to kind of reiterate what the cluster is versus a block. In a cluster, let's say this is CBO1, and these 4 boxes represent each of the practitioners within our community-based organization. They're all getting the same treatment because the treatment was assigned to the cluster. Whereas in blocking, I still have the same 4 practitioners, but I've randomly assigned each of the conditions to 2 of the practitioners, and the other 2 get the other conditions. So that's the big difference between cluster versus block. Okay, so what's the issue with failing to account for clustering? So your unexplained variance in general is going to be way underestimated. And when I do that, that inflates my type 1 error. So exactly what we don't want to do, right? We do not want to start finding significance where there is no significance. So we end up with a bunch of false importance. You get a bunch of, we'll call it spurious correlations. The other issue you run into is kind of the concept of the Simpson's paradox. Now I'm using this a little bit loosely, but basically what happens is your conclusions change when the clustering is accounted for compared to when you ignore it. So there could be some aspect of the clustering that if I ignore it and just treat everybody as if they were randomly assigned their condition, it's going to get masked when I fail to account for clustering. And again, that leads to false conclusions. Okay, so for model-based analysis or cluster studies, it gets a little more difficult. You're going to require, at a minimum, a random intercept type model. So you're going to be in a mixed model situation. Typically, it's going to be more complicated than that because the designs themselves space things out a little bit more, and we have to account for both between and within type of effects, between subject and within subject effects. We have to account for the correlation in some way, shape, or form. And oftentimes, not always, sometimes you can argue there is no random effective time. And that's the issue because we can't assign time, right? Time just marches forward. We can choose when we're going to measure people, but we didn't randomly assign that. That's just when they get it. But there still can be a random effective time when we talk about the differences, right? If I'm in a crisis center, different times of the year, maybe, unfortunately for me, maybe busy, whereas the shelter would not be busy, right? So we're going to have some random effect from that. And then we also have the random cluster effects themselves. And then the last piece about the model-based analysis is now your interpretations are going to be less straightforward, especially if your goal is not only to look at the system level kind of outcomes, but to also look at, well, how did we do for the individual, right? Because now individuals are nested within the cluster. We have to account for all that and still tease out, did this have an effect for the average, on average, for the people that were involved? Okay, are there any questions to this point? I feel like I'm flying here. So the last thing I was asked to talk about are kind of the typical outcomes for community-based research. And I'm going to talk about the outcome in the measurement level here real quick. So we have this concept of reach, which I will define in a minute, but this one's going to be measured on the cluster level. We also have effectiveness, which is also a cluster level metric, and implementation, also a cluster level metric. Then we have these concepts of improvement and maintenance. Both of these can be at the cluster level and or at the observational level. You can measure it at both levels there. So we can see where, depending on what our outcome of interest is, we may be buying ourselves into a more and more complicated analytical design, or analysis, excuse me. So reach is defined generically as the number that are referred, quote unquote, to some program over the number that were eligible to be referred. The problem here lies in how do we define eligible? And this has been difficult, I think, in every program that I've been involved with, is trying to come up with what is a common definition we can all agree on that would be legitimate to say, yes, this is an eligible person. And again, a lot of this, since we're talking about these different entities, it's going to depend, where are they at? Where is that client or individual at in regards to their problem, to whether or not they should be approached? So one of the easiest definitions would be just take all comers. That's usually, again, a little too broad. So then we come up with the idea of, well, new clients only. They're completely naive to the program. They have no history with the program whatsoever. And that's another option. And it's by far the cleanest as far as analytically post-analysis concerned. We can look at previous clients that meet specific criteria, so we can carve out some previous people that have had contact with an organization, but they only had contact in a certain context, and it won't influence, we don't think, the outcome. So we could design some criteria there. Or we can look at it based on the type of interaction. So this would be some other subset of all comers. So we're not worried about previous or new. It's anybody that walks in the door from the time we start the study, but it's going to have to be based on what type of interaction are they actually coming in for. Then the next definition we need to look at is the number referred. And the issue here is, how do we define a failure to refer? So we can do it as a certain number of encounters before the failure. So they get X number of chances, and if they haven't done it by the third encounter, they're considered fail. Or is it first time they come in, they should have been offered, and the answer is they didn't get offered, so it's a failure, something like that. And we have to balance that with the extenuating circumstances. Again, are we looking at an acute or crisis type of encounter versus a normal encounter? So the next outcome was effectiveness. Here we're talking about the number that participate over the number referred. Again, we've already talked about what we have to come up with the number that referred. But once we have number referred, we're okay. Number to participate seems pretty benign. But now we have an issue of, what if they only show up once? Do we consider that participation? That would be the intent to treat kind of definition of participation. Do we want them to attend 75% or more of whatever our intervention or our condition is? We just need to be able to define this. We want to define it ahead of time so that we're not, trying to move the mark to fit the data. We want to have it defined ahead of time and stick with that. And then we have the idea of improvement. Again, this is a cluster level. It's, again, another proportion, dichotomous type outcome. Number participating, we already defined that in the previous slide. And now we're looking at the number responding. And again, we run into the same idea of, how do we define response? And that could be, if we're going with, as I have it defined here as improvement, as dichotomous, we have to have some threshold that says, okay, if somebody meets this value, they're considered a responder. And we count up how many people as a total that participated within this cluster and divide by the total participating, and that gives me my improvement. If I drop down to the observational level, this could be defined as a proportion on an individual, or it could be a numerical value. So when I talk about a proportion here, I'm not talking about X number of trials, X positive outcomes out of X number of trials. Here I'm talking about typically a % change. So I'm looking at a proportion, but it's more of a continuous proportion. So if I think of a weight loss study or something like that, or a diabetes study, and I'm looking for a certain % reduction in A1C, and I want to model the actual percentage, I can do that as a numerical value. Or I can say this threshold was met, they're now a 1 or a success. This threshold was not met, this one's a 0 and not met. I can look at different scores themselves. And I can also come in and look at specific time point comparisons between groups and say, I know I measured these people 12 times, but the time point I'm actually interested in is 6 months. Everything else is just kind of information, but the 12 or 6 month difference is where I'm really interested. So we can define improvement in a bunch of different ways. And then the last, I think that's my last concept, is the maintenance idea. And here we're utilizing the exact same outcome as we used in improvement, but now we're having to do a longitudinal study to make sure that once we get to whatever that defined time point of saying, yes, there is a difference, or where our target was, any gains made, can I keep it going as I move forward? So this is something that the primary investigator or the research team needs to define ahead of time, what maintenance means. So we need to define an equivalence window. Because again, everything here is going to be random. We're not going to get exactly the same value at 12 months that we had at 6 months. But what we can look at is say, well, we don't want it to deviate more than 10% from the value that we observed at 6 months. Okay, now we've built our equivalence window. We can move forward and we can test that with what's known as a post hoc confidence interval. So we look at the confidence interval, and if the confidence interval contains 0, we're happy, right? Because we're within that window of what we're after. Okay. Any questions on that? Sorry. So the next one is the implementation. So we have adherence to protocol, and we have the number with X% adherence. So whatever the adherence number, whatever we're defining it as being, over the total number that are on the protocol. So that's pretty straightforward. The way we can look at this as well as without looking at adherence necessarily would be looking at the dosing. So if I look at like a state or not a stage, an incremental increase in effort of the intervention, I can look at automatic reminders. Is that sufficient to get what I need for adherence? Or do I get what I need from an implementation standpoint just using automatic reminders? Then I can add in automatic reminders plus some like small group sessions or something like that, or some sort of support. And do I get what I need? Versus automatic reminders plus small group sessions plus incentive, right? And I can keep stacking these and keep making it more and more complicated and try to get at what gives me the best bang for the buck, so to speak. And this opens you up to all sorts of other types of trials designs that I don't get to talk about, but I think somebody else is going to get to talk about, which is pretty exciting. How you can actually utilize these to try to do the cost benefit type of analysis. Then the next thing we have is consistency. So if I look at the process and or the procedures, are they changing based on time, day, or contact type? So one of the things that I've run into is that if you are looking at something that's a 24-hour operation, different, I'll just call them shifts, right? Different shifts have different amounts of responsibility or different amounts of burden. And based on that, you can see some changing, some things getting changed, not necessarily consciously, but things might be changing. So that the idea is, are we actually consistent in how we're applying the process and the procedures that we're using, or are we actually having an issue with how things are being performed? And then the last one is adherence to the core principles. So oftentimes, in real life, you write out a plan and this is how everything has to go. And oftentimes we can't hit every step exactly the way we want to. But there is some core and overall guiding structure that, as long as we meet the intent of each thing, we can say we are implementing successfully. So there are things we might have to cut out of the process in certain situations, but I still meet the overall intent. And we have to come up with a way to measure that. And we can do that as well from the concept of implementation. And Paul, if I butchered anything, please jump in and fix me. Okay, so my 5-bullet conclusion. The traditional study design principles carry over very readily to community-based research. The biggest issue we have is that our study units now are typically at a minimum one level above the observational unit. And if they're multiple levels above the observational unit, it just gets more and more complicated to analyze, but it's still doable. The sample size for a cluster trial has to strike a balance between the number of clusters themselves and the number of observational units available per cluster. And sometimes that might mean redefining what a cluster really means. The studies themselves are typically designed to get at the cluster level outcomes, although, you know, oftentimes people are also going to want to look at the individual level outcome, which is possible. Your interpretations have to be a little more guarded in that regard, but it's still doable. And the last piece is that, I guess that was my last piece, is that it's just harder to interpret when you get to the observational unit level when we've done a clustered study. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just that it's harder to interpret. It's a little more nuanced. Your conclusions are a little bit softer, I would say. All right, so that's all I have for today.